In 1910, a photograph was taken of the British royal family. King George V, Queen Mary, their 5 children, lined up in formal dress, staring into the camera with the composed expressions the palace required. If you look carefully at that photograph, you will notice something. There are 5 children in the frame, but George V had 6. The 6th child, the youngest, the one who does not appear, was a boy named John. He was 4 years old when that photograph was taken. He had already had his first seizure, and from that point forward, the palace began the slow, careful work of making him disappear, not from the family, but from history. John Charles Francis was born on the 12th of July, 1905, at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. He was the 5th son and 6th child of the then Prince of Wales, who would become King George V 5 years later. In those early years, John's childhood was not dramatically different from that of his siblings. He appeared in family photographs. He attended royal events. He was present at his father's coronation in 1911, at 6 years old, dressed in a page's uniform. Those who knew him described him as warm, affectionate, and unusually free-spirited for a child raised inside the rigid protocols of the Edwardian court. His governess, Charlotte Bill, known to the children simply as Lala, adored him. His mother, Queen Mary, wrote of him with genuine tenderness in her diaries. By all evidence, John was loved, but something was wrong, and it was becoming harder to ignore. Around the age of 4, John had his first epileptic seizure. In the early 20th century, epilepsy was one of the most misunderstood and stigmatized conditions in medicine. It was associated, in the public imagination, with mental illness, with moral weakness, with hereditary defect. Families of means did not speak of it. Aristocratic families spoke of it least of all. For the royal family, an institution whose entire authority rested on the perception of strength, continuity, and divine favor, a child with a serious, visible, unpredictable condition was not simply a private grief. It was a political problem. As John grew older, his seizures became more frequent and more severe. He also showed signs of what we might today recognize as a developmental disorder, social difficulties, unconventional behavior, a deep resistance to the formal structures that royal life demanded. His father, George V, was a man of rigid discipline who found his youngest son's behavior increasingly uncomfortable. Those close to the family recorded that the king struggled to be around John, and that John's presence at formal occasions had become a source of quiet anxiety for the palace. In 1916, when John was 11 years old, a decision was made. He would be moved to Wood Farm, a working farm on the Sandringham estate, several miles from the main house. He would live there with Lala Bill and a small household of staff. Local children were brought in to be his companions, a detail that says something about the care taken, at least by some, to give him something resembling a normal life. Queen Mary visited when she could. She wrote to him. She sent gifts. John, by the accounts of those around him, was happier at Wood Farm than he had ever been in the formal world of the palace. He had animals, open land, and people who treated him with uncomplicated warmth, but he was no longer visible. No longer mentioned in court circulars, no longer part of the public image of the royal family, and his illness was never disclosed. As far as the British public knew, Prince John simply did not exist. What followed was not unusual for its time, and that is precisely the point. The concealment of John's condition was not, by the standards of 1916, an act of exceptional cruelty. It was, in many ways, entirely in keeping with how Edwardian society handled disability in prominent families. The instinct was to protect the family's reputation, to shield the child from a public that would not have been kind, and to manage the image of an institution that could not afford to appear weakened. Whether that instinct served John or failed him is a question historians still debate. What is not debatable is this: the British public had a prince they did not know existed. A boy who had been born into one of the most powerful families on earth, who had sat for portraits and attended coronations, and who had then, quietly, been removed from view. His illness was his family's secret. And in this family, secrets had a way of lasting. On the 18th of January, 1919, John suffered a severe seizure at Wood Farm. He did not recover. He was 13 years old. Queen Mary's diary entry for that day is brief and controlled. She noted receiving the news, recorded her sorrow, and wrote that she and the king went to see his body. She wrote that he looked very peaceful. Lala Bill, the woman who had raised John for most of his life and had been with him when he died, was devastated. And then there was Edward, John's eldest brother, the future King Edward VIII, the man who would one day abdicate the throne, wrote a letter to his mistress the day John died. In it, he described his brother's death as the greatest relief imaginable. He wrote that John's life had been nothing but a living death. That letter has been read ever since as a window into the coldness that ran through parts of this family. A family capable of producing both the devotion of Lala Bill and the detachment of Edward on the same day, in response to the same death. Prince John was buried at St. Mary Magdalene Church in Sandringham, close to where he had spent his final years. His illness was made public only after he was gone. In the century since his death, John has become, in a strange way, one of the most talked about figures in British royal history, precisely because he was the one they tried not to talk about. The question of whether his family failed him, or whether they were simply people of their time, doing what their era asked of them, does not have a clean answer. What is clear is this: there was a prince. He was real. He was loved, at least by some. He lived 13 years inside an institution that had no idea what to do with him. And when he died, his eldest brother called it a relief, while the woman who had raised him wept. Both of those things are true at once. That, perhaps, is the most honest thing that can be said about him.